The snow had not stopped in 4 days. Gwyneth sat by the small hearth, feeding it the last of the split wood stacked against the wall. The cabin held 2 rooms, both narrow, both cold at the edges where the walls met the frozen ground outside. She had built the fire herself that morning, the same way she built it every morning, and she watched it now with the flat attention of someone who had run out of things to occupy her hands. A knock came at the door. Not urgent, measured. She knew the knock before she opened it. Coraline never knocked twice. "You look thin," Coraline said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She wore a cloak lined with fur that Gwyneth did not recognize, new since the last visit. Her hair was loose, pinned at one side with a silver clasp shaped like a wolf's head, identical hair to Gwyneth's own, except Gwyneth's had been braided tight for 3 years and had not seen an ornament in longer than that. "I eat what's rationed to me," Gwyneth said. "That's not my doing." "I didn't say it was." Coraline moved to the hearth and held her hands toward the fire, though she did not look cold. She never looked cold anymore, not since her first shift had settled into her blood and given her a body that ran warmer than most. Gwyneth remembered when they had both shivered the same amount in winter. That had ended 6 years ago. "Father wants to know if you've reconsidered your position," Coraline said. "There's nothing to reconsider. I don't have a position. I have a cabin." "You have his patience. That's a position." Coraline turned from the fire. Her eyes moved over the room, the bare shelf, the single chair, the mattress rolled against the far wall during the day to save space. "This won't last forever, you understand? Eventually the pack will ask why a wolfless woman still draws rations from Vantry stores. Then let them ask. They'll ask me, not you. I'm the one who has to answer for you at council." Gwyneth said nothing. There was no version of this conversation that ended somewhere useful. Coraline had come to remind her of the shape of things, the same shape it had held since Gwyneth turned 20 and failed again to shift. She did not come for comfort. She never had. "There's a rumor moving through the lower village," Coraline said, changing direction the way she always did when a conversation stopped serving her. "A trader came through yesterday. Says the Alpha King is riding the northern border himself. Something about rogues hitting supply routes near the ridgeline. Why would he ride it himself? Because kings don't trust reports they haven't seen with their own eyes." Coraline said it like a fact she had memorized rather than understood. "Doesn't matter to us. He won't come this far northwest. There's nothing near the Vantry boundary worth a king's attention." She left without saying goodbye, the way she always did. Gwyneth watched the door for a long moment after it shut, then went back to the fire, because there was nothing else to do with the rest of the evening, except wait for it to end. The storm picked up an hour after dark. Gwyneth heard it before she felt it. A shift in the sound the wind made against the cabin's north wall, rising from a low complaint into something with teeth. She checked the shutters, checked the door latch, and sat back down near the fire with a blanket pulled over her knees. The wood supply would not last the night if the storm kept building. She would need more by morning regardless of the cold. She was still awake past midnight when she heard the first sound outside that did not belong to weather. It came from the back of the cabin, past the woodpile, low and irregular. Not a howl, not the wind. Something with weight behind it, moving without control. Then the sound came again, and beneath the scrape of snow, she caught the broken edge of a human voice trying and failing to form a word. She should have stayed inside. Every rule she had been taught since childhood said strange sounds in a storm meant rogues, or worse, and a woman alone with no wolf to defend her had exactly one sound strategy, which was silence. Gwyneth stood with her hand on the latch and listened once more. Whoever was outside was close enough to have reached the lean-to, and weak enough to be losing a fight against the snow. She knew what it was to be left where no one intended to look. She took the skinning knife from its hook, wrapped the strap around her wrist, and opened the door only as far as she needed to slip through. The wind hit her first, sharp enough to steal the breath from her chest before she'd taken 3 steps. She followed the wall around to the back, where the woodpile sat under its half-collapsed lean-to, and found the source of the sound face down in the snow, one arm bent beneath him at an angle that suggested it hadn't been placed there on purpose. He was breathing. She could see that much from where she stood before she'd fully processed what she was looking at. She crouched beside him and turned him onto his back, and the moment her hand made contact with his shoulder, something moved through her chest that had no precedent in her body. Not warmth. Not exactly. Something sharper, more specific. A recognition that arrived before she had any information to justify it. She pulled her hand back instinctively, and then made herself put it back, because he was bleeding from a wound along his ribs, and the snow beneath him had already gone dark. His eyes opened. Amber, even in the dark, even half-focused with pain. "Who are you?" he said. It came out rough, barely a question. "Someone who found you bleeding in her woodpile." She got an arm under his shoulders. "Can you stand?" He tried. It cost him more than he let show in his face, but he got upright, one hand braced against the lean-to, breathing through whatever the movement had done to the wound in his side. Up close, he was larger than she'd registered from the ground, broad through the shoulders in a way that made the space behind her cabin feel smaller than it was. His hair had come loose from whatever had tied it back, dark red-brown strands plastered to his forehead by melting snow. A short beard covered his jaw, uneven where blood had dried into it. "There were more of them," he said, following the ridge trail. "More of who?" He didn't answer. His legs buckled slightly, and she caught the weight before it fully committed to the ground, and between the two of them they made it through the cabin door and into the single room with the fire, where she lowered him onto the floor near the hearth because the mattress was too far and he was too heavy to manage the distance. The smell of him reached her only once they were inside, out of the wind. Smoke, though not from her fire. Something underneath it, sharp and clean, like the air right before a hard freeze. It settled into her chest, the way the first touch had, low and specific, and she found herself breathing through her mouth for a moment to get some distance from it before returning to her work. She cut the fabric away from the wound with the small knife she kept for skinning game. The cut ran along his ribs, deep enough to worry her, shallow enough that it hadn't hit anything vital. Claw marks, not a blade. She had seen wolf injuries before, from pack disputes settled outside the formal circle, and she recognized the pattern immediately. "You were attacked by shifters," she said. "Rogues." He said the word through his teeth while she pressed a folded cloth against the wound. "Coordinated, not scattered ferals. They knew where my patrol would be before we did. Your patrol." He didn't answer that either, and she decided not to push. Whoever he was, whatever business had put him bleeding in a stranger's woodpile during a storm, he had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed rather than questioned. And the fact that he hadn't ordered her to do anything yet meant either he trusted her judgment or he had no strength left to argue. She packed the wound with clean cloth and bound it as tightly as she dared without cutting off his breathing. He watched her hands the entire time with an attention that made her aware of her own movements, aware of the shake in her fingers that she hadn't noticed until his eyes found it. "You're not pack-trained," he said. "Not for this kind of wound. I've had practice. Trapping, mostly. Animals don't hold still to be treated." She tied off the last knot. "You'll live if it doesn't fester. I don't have anything stronger than what's in this cabin. It's enough." "Mun." She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time since dragging him through the door. His eyes tracked her face the way a person's eyes move when they're trying to solve something without enough pieces to finish the picture. She had the uncomfortable sense that he was doing exactly that. "What's your name?" she said. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had dropped, careful in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "Bastion? Just Bastion? For tonight?" He shifted against the wall, testing the wound with a small grimace. "And you?" "Wynneth." He gave no answer, but a guarded recognition tightened briefly around his eyes before he concealed it. She dismissed the reaction before she could build a meaning from it. Names meant little when one person had offered only part of his own. The fire had burned low. She fed it 2 more pieces of wood from the dwindling supply, and did not think about what that meant for the rest of the night. Outside, the storm had not eased. If anything, it had gotten worse, the wind finding gaps in the walls she hadn't noticed before, carrying a cold that made the small room feel less like shelter and more like a held breath. "Your patrol," she said, returning to the thing he hadn't answered. "Are they looking for you?" They'll assume the worst by morning if I don't return to the ridge camp. He said it without particular concern. The flat assessment of someone used to accounting for casualties as part of a plan, rather than as a personal fear. It changes nothing tonight. I can't walk that distance in this weather, wound or not. Then you're here until it clears. It seems that way. She should have felt more uneasy about that than she did. A stranger, armed with nothing but the ruined remains of his clothing, bleeding on her floor, claiming an attack by coordinated rogues on a ridge trail she'd never heard mentioned in this territory before. Every instinct her father had drilled into her about caution, about keeping her head down, about never giving anyone a reason to look twice at the wolfless daughter exiled to the border cabin, argued against every choice she had made in the last hour. And yet the room did not feel dangerous. It felt instead like something had reorganized itself the moment he crossed the threshold, some quiet rearrangement she had no vocabulary for and did not entirely trust. "There's water in the pot by the door," she said. "I'll heat some. You should drink something before you sleep." "You don't have to do that. I didn't ask if I had to." She stood and crossed to the pot, glad for something to do with her hands that wasn't sitting close enough to feel the heat radiating off him, despite the blood loss. "You're in my cabin bleeding on my floor. The least I can manage is water." He watched her work without speaking, and the silence stretched into something that wasn't uncomfortable, so much as unfamiliar. She had lived alone long enough that silence had become the default state of her life, but this was a different silence. Occupied, considered. The kind that came from two people in a small space, each deciding how much to say. When the water had warmed, she brought it to him in the single clay cup she owned. His fingers brushed hers as he took it, and the same low pull moved through her chest again, sharper this time because she'd been braced for it, and it came anyway. "You felt that," he said, not a question. "I don't know what I felt." "Neither do I." He drank slowly, watching her over the rim of the cup. "It's not nothing. It's exhaustion. Yours from blood loss. Mine from dragging you through snow." She said it faster than she meant to, the words arriving before she'd fully decided to say them. "I don't know you. Whatever that was, it doesn't mean anything." He didn't argue the point, but he didn't agree with it either. He set the cup down carefully beside him and let his head rest back against the wall, eyes half closing against the firelight. "You could have left me out there," he said after a while. "Most people would have gone back inside and bolted the door. Most people would have been smarter than I was tonight." "I don't think that's true." His eyes opened again, steady on her face. "I think you knew exactly what you were doing when you came outside." She didn't answer that, because she wasn't certain it was wrong, and admitting that felt more dangerous than the storm outside. She banked the fire, pulled the second blanket from the shelf, and set it near enough that he could reach it without asking. Then she retreated to the far side of the room, where the cold pressed harder against the walls, and sat with her back against the wood, watching the door, waiting for whatever the storm intended to do with the rest of the night. Bastian's breathing evened out sometime before dawn, though whether he slept or simply stopped fighting the exhaustion, she couldn't tell in the dark. She stayed awake long after, listening to the wind lose some of its violence, listening to the fire settle into embers, aware the entire time of the stranger breathing on her floor and the strange, unshakable certainty that whatever had walked into her cabin tonight had already changed something she wouldn't be able to change back. The storm broke by mid-morning, but the wind that followed carried its own kind of punishment, cold enough to freeze the meltwater dripping from the eaves into thin blades of ice by noon. Bastian had not tried to stand yet. Gwyneth had told him not to, twice, and the second time he'd looked at her with an expression that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being told anything twice, but he'd stayed seated near the hearth regardless. "You're not from a border pack," he said, watching her grind dried herbs against a flat stone. "Border packs don't carry supplies like this. I gathered them myself, over years." She didn't look up. "There's not much else to do out here." "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have." He let it sit. She'd noticed that about him already, in the half-day since she'd found him bleeding behind her woodpile. He didn't push a question twice when the first refusal was clear, though he also didn't forget he'd asked it. She could see him filing things away behind his eyes, sorting them for later use. She mixed the herbs into water just short of boiling, and brought it to him. along with a fresh cloth to replace the one from the night before. When she peeled back the old binding, the wound had scabbed over at the edges. Angry red, but no worse than she'd expected from a claw injury of that depth. "You're healing faster than a normal wound should," she said. "I'm not injured the way a normal person would be. You're a shifter. I assume that from the wound pattern." She pressed the new cloth against his ribs, testing his reaction. He didn't flinch. "What I meant was, even for a shifter, this is fast. Strong bloodlines heal faster." He said it the way someone recites a fact they've repeated many times, flat and practiced. "It's not remarkable." She thought it was, but she let it go, because arguing with a man about the pace of his own recovery felt like a waste of the little energy either of them had to spare. She finished binding the wound and sat back. And it was only then that she noticed him watching his own wrist with an expression that didn't belong to a man recovering from claw wounds. "What is it?" He turned his hand over, studying the inside of his wrist like it belonged to someone else. A faint mark had begun to form there, thin lines just beneath the surface of the skin, barely visible in the dim light of the cabin, but present enough that his thumb kept returning to trace it. "Nothing," he said, and pulled his sleeve down over it before she could look closer. A bruise from the fall. She didn't believe him, but she also didn't have the standing to demand the truth from a stranger she'd known less than a full day, so she let the lie stand and returned to the fire, feeding it the last split log from the pile she'd need to replace before nightfall regardless of guests. The day moved slowly after that. Bastian slept in short stretches, waking each time with the alertness of someone who didn't trust unconsciousness, even when his body clearly needed it. Between the sleeping, he asked questions, careful ones, phrased in ways that made them sound incidental even when they weren't. "How long have you lived out here alone?" 4 years. That's a long time for someone your age to manage a cabin this far from pack support." "I manage." "That's not what I asked." She set down the knife she'd been using to portion the last of the dried meat and looked at him directly. "You ask a lot of questions for a man who won't tell me his real name." A trace of caution returned to his expression. "Bastian is my name. You said, for tonight, when I asked. That's not the same as saying it's real." He didn't answer that, which told her more than an answer would have. She went back to the meat, cutting it into smaller pieces than necessary because her hands needed something precise to focus on. The quiet between them remained unresolved. "The rations here," he said eventually, changing direction the way people did when a subject had gotten too close to something they weren't ready to give up. "They're thin for someone doing physical work alone in this climate. I get what the pack allots." "Which is?" "Enough to survive. Not more." She didn't look up from the meat. "That's the arrangement." Each delivery also contained a small paper packet of dark mineral powder, stamped with the Van Tree Infirmary seal. She had been instructed to stir it into broth to prevent the weakness common to wolfless adults in winter. It tasted bitter enough to linger on her tongue for hours, but refusing anything marked by the pack healer would have given Alaric another reason to call her ungrateful. Bastian's attention moved to the unopened packet on the shelf. "And you take that with every delivery?" "That's what the instructions say." He reached for it, but stopped before touching the seal. "Leave this one closed. You don't know what it is. Neither do you. That's the problem. Keep it until a healer outside Van Tree can identify it." Gwyneth looked at the packet, then moved it to the far end of the shelf. "Whose arrangement?" She hesitated long enough that the answer became obvious regardless of whether she gave it. "My father's." Bastian went still in the way of someone discovering that a familiar rule had been deliberately broken. "Your father restricts your rations, and my father exiled me to this cabin 4 years ago, and considers the rations a mercy he's not obligated to extend." She kept her voice level, the tone she used for facts that had long since stopped being wounds and had become simply true. "I don't expect you to understand pack law from wherever you're from. I understand pack law well enough." His voice had gone quieter, but there was an edge underneath it now that hadn't been there before. "What I don't understand is what you did to earn 4 years of exile. I failed to shift." She said it plainly, because there was no way to dress it up that made it sound like anything other than what it was. "I turned 20, and I still hadn't shifted, and my sister had manifested an alpha wolf 2 years earlier. A wolfless daughter isn't useful to a pack like mine. So I was sent here. where I couldn't embarrass anyone by existing where people could see me. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks against the hearthstone. Bastian didn't look at it. He was looking at her with an attention that felt different from the curiosity he'd shown all day. Sharper, more focused, like he'd just found the piece of the picture he'd been missing. "Wolfless," he said. "At 20. You've heard the term before. Most shifters have. It's not a kind one. I know what it means." He shifted against the wall, careful of the wound. "I also know that late shifts happen. Rare, but documented. Some bloodlines suppress longer than others before the first change settles. My father didn't consider that a possibility worth exploring. He considered it a liability worth removing from sight." Bastian said nothing to that for a long moment. And when he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its earlier caution. "That's not how a pack in good standing treats a daughter who hasn't shifted. Delayed, unclaimed, even unmated. Not exiled to a border cabin with restricted rations. You'd have to ask my father why he chose that path. I stopped asking years ago. I might." She looked up at that, sharp. "You said you're not from a border pack. You said your patrol answers to someone. Who exactly are you?" The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment she thought he might finally answer it honestly. Instead, something outside the cabin caught his attention first. The low sound of horses, several of them, moving through the snow at a pace that suggested purpose rather than accident. Bastian was on his feet before she'd fully processed the sound, moving with a speed that shouldn't have been possible given the wound in his side, and only the tightening of his jaw betrayed what the movement cost him. "That will be my men," he said. "They'll have tracked the ridge trail by now. Your men. Stay inside." He said it without the softness he'd used earlier, an order rather than a request. And she felt the shift in him immediately. The way his bearing changed from patient stranger to something with more weight behind it. "Whatever happens outside this door in the next few minutes, stay inside until I say otherwise." She didn't stay inside. She followed him to the door and watched through the gap as 4 riders came through the tree line, and the man at the front dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, crossing the snow with the urgency of someone who'd expected to find worse than what he found. "My lord." The man's eyes moved over Bastian's bound ribs, the torn shirt, the blood dried into the fabric, and his shoulders eased slightly at whatever he read there. "We lost your trail past the ridge. Feared the worst." "I'm alive, Audiwell, barely inconvenienced." Bastian's voice had taken on a different register entirely, clipped and certain. "The rogues who attacked my patrol were coordinated, not scattered ferals working the border for scraps. I want a full accounting of the Ridge Camp's losses before we return." Gwyneth stood in the doorway, unmoving, processing the word he'd used. "My lord." Audiwell's gaze found her then, taking her in with the quick assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating strangers for threat before anything else. "Who is this?" "The woman who found me bleeding in her woodpile during the storm and dragged me inside instead of leaving me for the snow." Bastian said it without turning to look at her, his attention still on Audiwell. "She has my gratitude, and she'll have my protection. The Ridge report will say only that I found shelter near the northwest boundary. Her name does not leave the men who rode into this clearing until I know what attention would cost her." "Understood, my lord," Audiwell said, though the glance he gave Gwyneth suggested he understood there was more behind the order than gratitude alone. Something passed between the two men. Brief, wordless, the kind of exchange that happened between people who had worked together long enough to communicate without needing full sentences. Audiwell nodded once, sharp, and turned to relay something to the other riders in a voice too low for Gwyneth to catch. Bastian turned back to her finally, and for a moment the authority in his bearing softened into something closer to what she'd seen from him inside the cabin. "I have to return. There's a camp that needs to know I'm alive, and a report I need to make about what happened on that ridge. You never told me who you are." "No," he agreed. "I didn't. Are you going to?" For a moment, refusal seemed more likely than an answer. Then he said, "Not today, but I'll come back, and when I do, I'll tell you everything you're owed. You don't owe me anything. I gave you water and a floor to bleed on. You gave me more than that, and we both know it." His eyes held hers, steady despite the exhaustion still visible in the set of his shoulders. "I'll return, Gwyneth. That's not a courtesy. It's a fact." He mounted with visible effort, one of the riders steadying him as he settled into the saddle. And Wyneth stood in the doorway and watched the small column turn back toward the tree line and disappear into the white distance beyond the ridge. The cabin felt larger once they were gone, and colder, in a way that had nothing to do with the fire burning low behind her. She went back inside and sat near the hearth where he'd spent the night, and his absence announced itself almost immediately, a taut awareness beneath her breastbone that had not existed before he arrived, and now refused to be ignored. She pressed her palm flat against her sternum, testing whether stillness would loosen it. It didn't ease. If anything, it sharpened as the hours passed. A persistent ache that had no obvious cause and no obvious cure. The kind of sensation the pack elders described in old stories about bonds that arrived before either party was ready for them. She had heard those stories as a child and dismissed them as embellishment, the sort of thing storytellers added to make ordinary matches sound like fate. She was less certain of that now. By evening, the awareness had not faded, and she found herself standing at the small window more than once, watching the tree line for movement that never came. She blamed exhaustion and isolation, but the explanation weakened each time she tried to make it carry the full weight of what she felt. She did not tell Coraline when her sister visited 3 days later to check on the rations. She did not mention the stranger, the wound, the mark she'd glimpsed on his wrist before he covered it, or the word Ottawell had used without thinking, my lord. She kept all of it folded away where her sister couldn't reach it, because whatever this was, whatever had walked into her cabin during the storm and left something behind that ached like absence, it was the first thing in 4 years that belonged to her alone. The messenger arrived a week after Coraline's visit, his horse lathered despite the cold, carrying a seal Wyneth didn't recognize pressed into dark wax. Alaric read the letter twice before he spoke, standing in the doorway of the main house with Coraline at his shoulder, and Wyneth summoned from her cabin for the first time in months, standing at the edge of the yard where she'd been told to wait. The Alpha King has called a gathering, Alaric said. Every pack in the northern territories. Alliances, tributes, presentations of heirs. He folded the letter along its original crease. We leave at first light. All of us, Coraline asked. You, as heir. Myself, as Alpha. His eyes moved to Wyneth, flat and considering. And her as staff. The king's summons requires a full accounting of household. It would raise questions if she wasn't present in some capacity. I can stay behind, Wyneth said. No one would question it. Someone would question everything about this pack if given the chance, and I don't intend to give them one. Alaric's tone left no room for negotiation. You'll travel as Coraline's attendant. You'll dress as staff, eat as staff, and speak only when spoken to. Is that understood? Understood. He turned and went back inside without further comment, and Coraline lingered a moment longer, studying her twin with an expression that might have been curiosity if it hadn't been so carefully empty of warmth. You look different, Coraline said. I look the same as I did a week ago. You don't. Coraline tilted her head slightly, the way she did when assessing something she couldn't immediately categorize. I can't place it, but you do. Wyneth said nothing, and after a moment, Coraline shrugged and walked away. Wyneth remained in the yard with the bond drawn taut beneath her ribs, the same unrelenting thread that had followed her through the 10 days since Bastion's men rode out of her clearing. The journey took 3 days across terrain that grew rougher the further east they traveled, the low hills of Vantry territory giving way to steeper passes where the snow sat deeper and the wind carried an edge that cut through even the thickest cloaks. Wyneth walked behind the horses most of the distance, carrying what she could of the party's supplies, while Coraline rode ahead beside their father, speaking in tones too quiet to carry back. On the second night, camped in the shelter of a rock overhang, Wyneth overheard enough of the conversation to understand its shape. At the Eastern Trade Road that afternoon, their column had met the route climbing north from the southern territories. A young alpha named Rendell had joined them there, traveling from a pack whose lands lay 2 days below Vantry. The talk wasn't about alliance in the abstract. It was about marriage, about combined borders, about the kind of arrangement that expanded a pack's reach without requiring a single battle. He's not unreasonable, Coraline said to their father, low enough that Wyneth had to strain to catch it from where she sat mending a torn strap by the fire's edge. His territory borders the eastern trade routes. If we combine holdings, Vantry stops being a minor pack answering to everyone else's terms. And the marriage itself is a formality. I don't need to feel anything for the man to understand what the arrangement gives us. Coraline said it with the same flat practicality she brought to most decisions. Feelings are for people who can afford them. Gwyneth kept her eyes on the strap in her hands and said nothing, but the sentence lodged somewhere and stayed there. Another piece of evidence in the long account she'd been keeping since childhood, of exactly how her sister measured the world. The castle came into view on the afternoon of the third day, rising from a plateau surrounded by cleared ground that made the approach visible for miles in every direction. Gwyneth had never seen a structure that size. The walls alone dwarfed the entire cabin she'd lived in for 4 years, and the number of banners flying from its towers suggested packs from territories she'd never even heard named. They were sorted at the gate the way cattle were sorted at market. Staff directed toward the servants' entrance on the north side. Nobility and heirs waved through the main courtyard with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. Gwyneth found herself herded along with a dozen other attendants from various packs, stripped of the modest cloak she'd worn for the journey, and issued a plain gray dress that marked her, immediately and unmistakably, as someone who belonged to the lower ranks of the gathering. She didn't mind the dress. She minded less than she expected to, actually, because 4 years in a border cabin had taught her that clothing said very little about the person wearing it. What she minded was the way the other attendants looked at her when they learned her name. The flicker of recognition when they connected Vantry with the twin who hadn't shifted. The pack's shame kept just out of sight until moments like this one, when proximity made the shame impossible to ignore entirely. The banquet hall that evening held more people than Gwyneth had seen gathered in one place in her entire life. Long tables ran the length of the room, packed with alphas and their families from a dozen territories, all of them dressed in the particular finery of people who wanted to be seen making an impression. Coraline sat near the front with their father, close enough to the head table that Gwyneth understood immediately how much weight the invitation itself was meant to carry. Gwyneth stood along the back wall with the other attendants, tasked with refilling cups and clearing plates, a role she performed with the same careful attention she'd have given to any unfamiliar work. It kept her hands busy and her eyes down, which suited her, because the alternative was looking directly at a room full of strangers who all seemed to know exactly who she was and exactly why she didn't belong among them. The head table filled slowly as the evening progressed, alphas arriving in order of rank, until finally a stir moved through the room that told Gwyneth, before she'd even turned to look, that the king himself had entered. She recognized him before she'd fully processed that she should. The beard was the same, though trimmed now, and his hair had been tied back properly instead of hanging loose and snow-wet the way she remembered it. He moved through the hall with an ease that suggested he'd walked into rooms like this 1,000 times before, nodding to alphas as he passed, exchanging a few words here and there, every motion measured and unhurried. Then his eyes found her. She watched it happen in real time, watched the moment his gaze crossed the length of the crowded hall and landed on her standing against the back wall in her plain gray dress, and watched him stop walking entirely, mid-stride, in front of an entire room of the most powerful people in the Northern Territories. The pull in her chest, dull but constant for nearly 2 weeks, surged so sharply she had to grip the edge of the serving table to keep from making a sound. Bastian's hand went to his wrist without seeming to notice he'd done it, and for one unguarded second the practiced calm left his face before he drew it back into place. The alpha beside him, an older man with steady eyes, said something quiet, and Bastian answered without looking away from Gwyneth, his jaw tight. Conversation near the head table had already begun to falter. Alphas who'd been mid-sentence trailed off, following the king's fixed attention across the room, and Gwyneth felt the exact moment the entire hall's focus began sliding toward her, like water finding a new channel. A man detached himself from the head table and crossed the room quickly, intercepting Bastian's path before he'd taken another step. Gwyneth recognized him from the clearing outside her cabin. Ottewell, the one Bastian had called by name, the one who'd looked at her that day with quick, careful assessment. "My lord," Ottewell said, low enough that only those closest could hear, though the whole hall was watching regardless. "The council is seated. They're waiting on your welcome." "Of course." Bastian's voice had gone smooth again, the lapse concealed. But his eyes moved once more to Wyneth before he turned fully back toward the head table. Forgive the delay. A long ride catches up with a man eventually. The excuse landed thin, and Wyneth could see, even from across the room, that several of the gathered alphas weren't buying it. A murmur moved through the tables nearest the front, quiet but unmistakable, the sound of powerful people filing away something they intended to discuss later. Ottawell guided Bastian the rest of the way to his seat, with a hand at his elbow, subtle enough to look like courtesy rather than management, and the king took his place at the head of the table and began the welcoming address the room had been waiting for. His voice carried easily across the hall, formal and measured, thanking the assembled packs for their attendance, outlining the purpose of the gathering, the alliances to be discussed, the tributes to be exchanged. Wyneth heard almost none of it. She stood against the back wall with her pulse refusing to settle, and the memory of his face, cracking open for one unguarded second in front of everyone who mattered in the Northern Territories, replaying itself over and over. Coraline found her an hour later, during the lull between courses when attendants were permitted a brief respite near the kitchen doors. "What was that?" Coraline said. It wasn't really a question. What was what? Don't. Coraline's voice had dropped into the register she used when she'd already decided someone was lying to her. "The king stopped walking when he saw you. In front of the entire hall. I want to know why." "I don't know why. You're a poor liar. You always have been." Coraline studied her face with the same clinical attention she brought to negotiating marriages. "Something happened. I don't know what yet, but I intend to find out. There's nothing to find. We'll see." Coraline turned and walked back toward the front of the hall, and the bond's pull tightened into warning. Wyneth knew her sister well enough to understand that Coraline did not make idle threats, and she did not abandon a question once she had decided it might contain leverage. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of refilled cups and cleared plates. Wyneth's attention split between her work and the head table, where Bastian sat through the remaining ceremony without once looking her way again, his composure fully restored, his conversation with the alphas around him, giving no further hint of what had happened when he first entered the hall. But she caught Ottawell watching her twice during the meal, brief glances that carried none of the hostility she might have expected from a king's man assessing a threat. He looked instead like someone measuring the danger around her, rather than the danger she posed. When the last trays had been returned to the kitchens, Ottawell met her beside the service stair. "The king would like a word," he said. The king had nearly 2 weeks to find words. Ottawell accepted the answer without defending the man he served. "He knows that. Come with me or don't. The choice is yours." That, more than the request itself, made her follow. He led her through 2 narrow passages used by servants and guards, then into a map room overlooking the inner courtyard. Bastian stood beside the cold hearth with his coat unfastened at the wrist. The mark was no longer faint. It curved beneath his skin in dark, deliberate lines, the same shape she had seen beginning in her cabin before he covered it. Ottawell closed the door and remained outside. "You said you would come back," Wyneth said. "I did." Bastian did not reach for an excuse. "And then I returned to a ridge camp with 2 men dead, another missing, and evidence that the attack had been planned around our patrol changes. By the time the wounded were moved and the border secured, the first delegations for this gathering were already on the road. A message would have required less time than a journey. A message bearing my seal would have passed through your father's hands. An unsigned message could have placed you in danger without giving you any protection at all." He paused, and the control in his voice did not hide the regret beneath it. "I chose silence for you without asking whether you wanted it. That was wrong." The apology unsettled her more than a defense would have. Men with authority usually explained why their choices had been necessary and called the explanation accountability. "Who are you when there isn't blood in your beard and snow in your hair?" she asked. "Bastian Valor, Alpha King of the Northern Territories." He said the title without ceremony. "And the mark on my wrist is a forming mate mark. The royal healers agree on that much." The thread between them tightened, not painfully this time, but with the clean certainty of a door closing behind a truth she could no longer pretend not to know. "You knew before tonight. I suspected in your cabin. I knew when the mark continued to darken after I left." He looked toward the shuttered window, jaw set. 3 council elders advised me to let it fade unacknowledged until the border alliances were signed. They said a king could not risk the crown over a woman without a wolf from a minor pack. And what did you say? That a crown preserved by abandoning an innocent woman was not worth preserving. His eyes returned to hers. But recognizing a bond publicly before I knew what you wanted would have been another way of taking the choice from you. Gwyneth had imagined anger carrying her through this conversation. Instead, what she felt was sharper and more difficult, relief held beside distrust, neither one willing to yield. What happens if I say I want nothing from you? You return to Vantry under royal protection, and I carry the bond without using it as a claim on your life. His answer came without delay. What happens next belongs to you as much as it does to me. She studied him long enough to decide he understood the weight of what he had said. And if I don't know yet, then we do nothing tonight except tell each other the truth. He told her about the patrol losses, the search for the rogue faction, and the limits of what the healers understood about a mate mark forming on one person before the other had shifted. Then he told her what Ottowell had been doing since the day he left her cabin. I asked him to examine Vantry's border reports and the terms of your exile, Bastian said. Restricted rations without a council finding are irregular. So is the packet you described receiving with every delivery. Gwyneth's attention sharpened. The mineral powder. Ottowell found payments from the Vantry household to suppliers licensed to handle restricted herbs. The entries are incomplete, and the name of the patient was omitted. He is looking for the healer who filled the orders before we accuse anyone of a crime. For the first time since Bastian had told her to leave the packet sealed, Gwyneth considered the change in her own body. The dull fatigue she had accepted as part of winter had begun to lift before the messenger arrived, then eased more quickly during 3 days of common travel stores and the meals served at the castle. She had blamed warmer food and less time alone in the cold. You think my father put something in my rations? I think there is enough evidence to ask the question, and not enough yet to answer it honestly. Bastian stepped closer, stopping well before the distance became a demand. You don't have to return to the attendants' quarters. I can place you under royal protection tonight. Gwyneth pictured Alaric learning that the records had been noticed, pictured every ledger and remaining packet disappearing before morning. No. If I change rooms now, he will know someone is looking. I stay where he expects me to be until Ottowell has proof. That carries risk. So does letting him erase whatever he did. She held Bastian's gaze. You don't get to decide which risk I can bear. No, he said. I don't. It was not trust. Not yet. But it was the first decision they made with both of them standing inside it. She didn't sleep well that night, crowded into a shared attendance quarters with a dozen other women from a dozen different packs, all of them exhausted from the journey and the evening's work. She lay awake listening to unfamiliar breathing and thought about Bastian's apology, the payments Ottowell had found, and Coraline's promise to uncover whatever connected her sister to the king. Remaining where Alaric expected to find her was dangerous, but the decision was hers, and that difference mattered, even while fear kept her awake. Coraline did not wait long. 2 days after the banquet, she found a guard who had ridden with Bastian's northern patrol earlier that winter, a broad man named Hollis stationed near the castle gates. She approached him during the changing of shifts, when the courtyard was busy enough to make the conversation look incidental. You rode the western ridge during the rogue attack, Coraline said. Hollis's expression became guarded. I did. The king was separated from you for 1 night. The search ledger says he was recovered the following day near Vantry's northwest boundary. Search ledgers record routes, my lady. They do not entitle anyone reading them to the people found along those routes. Coraline's smile remained polite. Then there was someone. There was shelter. That's all I am authorized to confirm. A cabin? Hollis met her eyes without answering. You should direct further questions to Lord Ottowell. He stepped away before she could turn his refusal into another question. He had not broken the king's order, but he had confirmed the recovery point, and Coraline knew Vantry's northwest boundary as well as Gwyneth did. There was only one occupied shelter close enough to the ridge trail for an injured man to reach during that storm. Gwyneth had watched the exchange from the shadow of the stable wall, where she'd been sent to collect linens. She understood what her sister now possessed. Not proof, but a route from the banquet's public reaction back to the cabin. Over the next 3 days, Coraline spent hours in the council archive, requesting old censures involving scent manipulation and coerced claims. Rendell stopped joining the Vantry table for evening meals. The alliance Coraline had treated as a certainty was already retreating from the possibility of scandal. And with it went the political future she had spent years building around her position as sole heir. The threat she believed Wyneth posed was no longer personal alone. If the king recognized the bond, Coraline could lose Vantry, Rendell, and every agreement that depended on her remaining the uncontested daughter of the pack. She chose the formal council session 3 days later, when every alpha present had gathered to finalize the alliances, because it was the last place a recognition could be stopped before it became political fact. Wyneth had been posted near the back wall again, part of the small army of attendants required to keep the proceedings running, when Coraline rose from her seat at the Vantry table and asked to be heard. The council chamber went quiet. Alaric's expression, beside her, betrayed nothing, but his hand had gone still against the table's edge in a way that suggested he hadn't expected this, and didn't yet know what direction it was heading. "I have information relevant to the king's conduct," Coraline said, her voice pitched to carry the full length of the hall. "Information the council should hear before any alliance is finalized." Bastian, seated at the head table beside the eldest council members, did not move, but his posture sharpened. "Speak then," said one of the council elders, a gray-haired alpha from a territory Wyneth didn't recognize. Less than 3 weeks ago, during the border unrest, the king was separated from his patrol for one night in a storm, Coraline said. He was recovered the following day, near a cabin on Vantry's northwest boundary. "That cabin belongs to my sister, Wyneth, who has lived there in isolation for 4 years. The low conversation around the tables stopped. Wyneth felt the scrutiny turn toward her, but it no longer found her entirely unprepared. "My sister has no wolf," Coraline continued. "She failed every shift attempt after coming of age. Yet after one night alone with her, the king entered this court unable to conceal a reaction strong enough to interrupt the opening of his own gathering. I have reviewed the council records concerning coerced scent fixation and prohibited binding rights. I am asking for a formal inquiry before any claim involving my sister is recognized, and before alliances are signed on assumptions that may prove false." The charge was still blood magic, whatever disciplined language Coraline wrapped around it, but the purpose beneath it was clearer now. She was not only accusing Wyneth, she was trying to stop the bond from changing the succession of Vantry before the council acknowledged that change as fact. "That's a serious charge," the elder said, looking to Coraline. "Do you have evidence beyond a guard's silence and a king's reaction?" "I have the fact that she concealed it from her household and returned to this court pretending not to know the man who stopped at the sight of her," Coraline said. "What honest woman hides a king's presence in her home unless she understands that the circumstances will not survive scrutiny?" Alaric rose slowly from his seat, and for one moment, Wyneth allowed herself to hope, foolishly, that he might speak in her defense. Instead, he addressed the council with the same flat authority he used for every difficult matter. "I was unaware of any of this," he said. "If my daughter concealed the king's presence on Vantry land, she did so without my knowledge or sanction. I extend the council my full cooperation in whatever investigation is required." He did not look at her. He had already decided, Wyneth understood, which side of this argument protected his own standing, and it was not hers. "This is absurd," Wyneth said, before she could stop herself, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be in a hall this large but clear enough to carry. "I found an injured man in the snow. I gave him shelter because leaving him to die felt like a worse crime than breaking some rule about announcing visitors. There was no magic. There was no manipulation. There was a wound that needed binding and a storm that wouldn't let up. And yet the king's composure broke the moment he saw you again," Coraline said. "In front of this entire hall. That's not evidence of blood magic," Bastian said. The hall turned toward him. He had not moved from his seat, but his voice now carried the authority he had kept restrained through the accusation. "Wyneth and I have already discussed the truth Coraline is presenting as discovery." He rose and pushed back the sleeve of his coat, exposing the inside of his wrist to the gathered light. The mark she'd glimpsed once in her own cabin, faint and easily dismissed as a bruise, had darkened and sharpened into something unmistakable, fine lines curling beneath the skin in a pattern too deliberate to be accidental. "This mark began forming the night I was found in that storm," he said. "Before I knew her name, before either of us understood what it meant. It is not something blood magic produces. Every shifter in this hall knows what a mate mark looks like when it settles, and every shifter here can see this one is real." The elder leaned forward, studying the mark from across the distance, and several other council members did the same, murmuring among themselves in tones that had shifted from suspicion toward something more uncertain. "A mate bond is not created by a spoken claim or a court's permission," Bastian continued. "It begins with recognition. Neither of us summoned it. It formed when I was bleeding in her woodpile, and she chose to drag me inside instead of leaving me to the snow." His eyes moved to Coraline, steady and unflinching. "You have accused your own sister of a crime that carries execution. Present evidence, not inference. If you recognize her without inquiry, several pacts will reconsider the agreements before this council," Coraline said. "The Crown cannot pretend that consequence does not exist. Then they may reconsider," Bastian said. "I will not purchase their loyalty by abandoning an innocent woman." Coraline held her posture, but strain entered the careful set of her mouth. The mark could have been forced. "There are practices." "Name one," Bastian said. "Name a single documented practice that forces a mate bond through coercion rather than mutual recognition. The council has scholars present. Let them confirm or deny it." The elder called for the royal bond scholar rather than asking the room to decide by silence. An elderly woman named Maven crossed from the council benches, examined the mark without touching it, and asked Bastian when it had first appeared and how it had changed with distance. Her questions were spare and clinical. "Natural formation," she said when she finished. "No scarring from a cut right, no residue from a compulsion draft, and no interruption in the pattern. A coerced fixation may imitate longing. It does not produce a true mate pattern, and this is one." The finding removed the last useful foundation from Coraline's argument, leaving only suspicion and the fear attached to a wolfless woman near a throne. "I have witness testimony from Hollis," Coraline tried again, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Bring him forward," the elder said. Hollis was summoned, visibly uncomfortable at finding himself at the center of a council dispute he'd tried to avoid. Under direct questioning, he confirmed that the king had been separated from the patrol for one night and recovered the following day near the northwest boundary. He had not entered the cabin, had witnessed no ritual, and had never heard Wynneth demand anything from the king. His testimony established the route and nothing more. "This council finds no evidence to support the charge of forbidden practice," the elder said finally. "The mark presented by the king is consistent with natural mate bond formation. Lady Coraline, you have brought a serious accusation before this body without sufficient grounds. That is not a small matter." Coraline said nothing. Her face had gone carefully blank, the expression Wynneth recognized from childhood as the mask her sister wore when a plan had failed, and she hadn't yet decided how to recover from it. It was Ottawell who spoke next, stepping forward from where he'd stood near the king's table throughout the proceedings, a packet of copied ledgers in hand. "There is a separate matter the council should hear," he said. "At the king's direction, I examined the terms of Lady Wynneth's exile and the restricted supplies purchased by the Vantry household." He gave the records first to the keeper of seals, who compared the merchant's stamps, infirmary marks, and payment signatures against the originals already secured in the castle archive. Only after the keeper confirmed them did Ottawell address the hall. "The orders began 6 years ago and continued into the current winter. They list concentrated suppression herbs in quantities inconsistent with any documented treatment. After Lady Wynneth was sent to the northwest cabin, the same compounds were ground into packets labeled as mineral tonic and entered beside her ration deliveries. The final packet was prepared less than 3 weeks ago. Alaric had gone rigid at the Vantry table. Suppression herbs interfere with a shifter's ability to complete a first change," Ottawell continued. "In small doses, they can be used briefly when a healer has examined a patient and found an early shift dangerously unstable. No such examination appears in Wynneth's medical record. Sustained doses can delay a shift for years and may prevent it permanently. Copied accounts prove nothing," Alaric said. "A household purchases medicine for more than one person, which is why the council will hear from the healer who filled the orders," the eldest said. Healer Maris came forward from the witness benches and took the oath required for testimony against a ruling alpha. She had served Vantry for 6 years and resigned shortly before the gathering after refusing to authorize another renewal. Her voice remained level, but she did not look at Alaric when she spoke. Alpha Alaric told me Wyneth had shown signs of an unstable first shift, she said. I asked to examine her. He refused and ordered the initial course under his authority. 6 months later, I advised him to stop because no patient should remain suppressed without review. He increased the order instead. And the ration packets? The elder asked. His instruction. The powder was mixed with mineral salt so she would take it as a winter tonic. The packets carried the infirmary seal because he required my stores to prepare them. I objected in writing twice. Those letters are attached to the final ledger. The Keeper of Seals confirmed Alaric's countersignature on both refusals and on every renewed order. Why? Wyneth asked. The question came out steadier than she felt. Why would he do that? Maris hesitated. During a fever before her expected shift, Wyneth's scent and temperature changes matched descriptions of the old frost line. I told Alpha Alaric the signs were not proof. He said even the possibility would divide the succession. Coraline had already been presented to neighboring packs as his sole alpha heir. Every face in the hall turned toward Alaric, but the elders gave him the opportunity to answer before drawing judgment. You had no understanding of what a contested succession would have done to Vantry, he said. The denial had disappeared from his voice, replaced by the hard certainty with which he had justified every choice in Wyneth's life. Coraline was accepted. The Eastern negotiations depended on her. A second alpha daughter carrying a rarer line would have split the pack before either of them was old enough to control it. So you made certain there would be only one, Wyneth said. Then punished me for surviving what you did. Alaric looked toward the council rather than at her, measuring whatever remained of his defense and finding no place to set it. The room was no longer revising a rumor. It was listening to authenticated records, sworn testimony, and his own explanation of motive. The elders ordered the Vantry table held in place while they conferred. The guards at the doors moved only after the order was given. The elders conferred for the length of time it took a candle to burn down an inch, and when the eldest turned back to the hall, his voice carried the weight of a decision already made. Alaric of Vantry, the authenticated orders, the sworn testimony of your healer, and your own statement establish that you suppressed your daughter's shift without examination or lawful finding, continued the dose after medical objection, and exiled her for the condition you caused. Under the first blood protections, no alpha may deliberately disable a pack member to alter succession. This council therefore has authority to remove you without a separate territorial vote. He paused, letting the law settle before the sentence. You are stripped of the title of Alpha of Vantry, effective immediately. You are banished from Vantry territory and from all pack lands governed by this council. Guards will escort you from these halls within the hour. Alaric's face had gone the color of old ash. He looked to Coraline, perhaps expecting some final support, but his daughter was already measuring the ruins of a future that no longer included his protection. This is not finished, Alaric said, though the words had no force behind them anymore. 2 guards flanked him before he'd taken a full step from the table, their hands firm on his arms. And he did not fight the grip, because there was nothing left to fight for. Wyneth watched him go, and felt none of the satisfaction she might have once imagined feeling. What she felt instead was something quieter, more exhausted, the particular relief of a weight finally set down after years of carrying it without permission to complain. The ache beneath her ribs had not left her all evening, but its quality had changed in the last hour, sharpened rather than dulled, building toward a threshold she did not yet have words for. She pressed a hand flat against her chest and felt her own pulse there, faster than it should have been, faster than fear alone accounted for. Something's happening to her, Ottewell said, low to Bastian, and Wyneth realized she'd swayed slightly on her feet without meaning to. The suppression herbs had stopped 18 days earlier, when Bastian told her to leave the packet sealed, and her body had spent every day since then recovering from a restriction she had never understood until the ledgers named it plainly. Whatever 6 years of forced suppression had held back, it did not intend to wait any longer to arrive. Coraline turned toward her, one last defensive thought hardening behind her eyes, even as their father was taken toward the hall's entrance. "You did this," she said, quiet, almost to herself. "You always could have. He just made sure of it." "I didn't do anything," Wyneth said. "I just stopped being poisoned." The word landed hard in the space between them, and Coraline's control finally gave way. Not to grief, but to panic at the loss of the status around which she had built her entire identity. The change came without warning, the way Wyneth imagined it must for every shifter who'd waited years past their expected time. Heat spread through her limbs first, sharp and unfamiliar, followed by a pull at the base of her spine that had nothing to do with the mate bond and everything to do with a body finally allowed to become what it had always been meant to be. She heard herself make a sound she didn't recognize, low and involuntary, and then the hall tilted, and her vision sharpened into something wider, lower, filled with scents and sounds she'd never had access to before. When it settled, she stood on 4 legs, fur pale as frost, catching the torchlight in silver threads along her spine. A murmur swept through the hall, distinct from the murmurs before it, because a wolf that color was rare enough that most of the assembled alphas had only heard of it in old stories about bloodlines thought extinct generations ago. Coraline took a step back, then another, her attention moving toward the side entrance. "Remain where you are," the eldest ordered. A pair of royal guards closed the path only after the command. Coraline stopped rather than force them to restrain her in front of the assembled packs. "I am Vantree's recognized heir," she said. "My father's crime does not transfer to me." "No," the elder replied, "but your unsupported capital accusation is your own act, and the succession you claim was protected by that crime. The council suspends all recognition of you as heir pending formal review. You will remain under guard until that review is complete." He looked to where Wyneth stood, wolf form settling back into her human shape with the same disorienting speed it had arrived, leaving her breathless and shaking on the cold stone floor. "The council recognizes Wyneth of Vantree as bearing a bloodline previously believed lost to this pack. Her standing will be addressed once she is recovered." Bastian crossed the hall before anyone else could reach her, kneeling beside her without regard for the eyes of every alpha present, one hand steady against her back as she caught her breath. "You're all right," he said, not quite a question. "I don't know what I am right now." She managed something close to a laugh, thin and exhausted. 4 years, and it just happened. In the middle of a council hall. It happened because nothing was holding it back anymore. He helped her upright, and the mark on his wrist, still visible where his sleeve had slipped, caught the torchlight against the paler mark now forming on her own skin. Fine lines curling to match his, unmistakable to every shifter in the hall who looked closely enough to see it. "The bond is settling," he said, quiet, just for her. Fully now. No interruption left to slow it. She looked down at her own wrist, at the mark she hadn't noticed forming beneath the chaos of the last hour, and felt the constriction in her chest finally ease. The pull resolved into a steadier certainty, less like longing than arrival. On the second day after the council session, Bastian found Wyneth in the small winter garden, where the castle healers had told her to walk, until the soreness from her first shift eased. "The council can recognize the bond tomorrow," he said. "That does not mean you have to accept a union tomorrow." Wyneth looked through the glass at the snow collecting along the courtyard walls. "A mate bond doesn't erase 4 years of being told where to live, what to eat, and when I was allowed to speak. I won't leave one man's control and call another man's protection freedom." "Then don't." Bastian stood beside her without blocking the path back to the door. "Name what you require. No decisions about Vantree made around me. No use of the bond as an order. And when I say I need time, you hear the words instead of deciding what would be safer for me." "Agreed." She turned to face him. "You agreed quickly, because none of it should have required negotiation." The answer did not heal everything. It did, however, give her somewhere honest to begin. The council recognized their union 3 days after Wyneth's first shift, once she had recovered enough strength to stand through the ceremony without support, and had chosen to do so. Bastian took her hand before the assembled alphas and declared the bond before witnesses who could not dispute it, the marks on both their wrists plain evidence against any future challenge to its legitimacy. The council also named Wyneth acting alpha of Vantree, until the pact could hold a lawful confirmation under royal observation. The title did not pass to her because of Bastian. It returned authority to the daughter whose place in the succession had been taken through a crime. Rendell withdrew his marriage proposal to Coraline in writing before the ceremony began, dissolving the Eastern Agreement without demanding compensation from Vantry. His letter stated only that an alliance built on a concealed succession could not be considered valid. Coraline's final judgment followed the next morning: permanent removal from the Vantry succession, banishment from its territory, and 1 year under council supervision before she could petition another pact for residence. She would live, and she would have a future, but she would not be permitted to build it from the authority Alaric had preserved for her by poisoning her sister. Ottewell stood near the front of the witnesses during the ceremony. When the hall began to empty, Gwyneth caught him before he could retreat into the work waiting beyond it. "You found the records," she said. "And Maris." The king ordered an inquiry. "I followed where it led." "You could have followed it carelessly." "You didn't." She held out her hand. "Thank you." Ottewell accepted it with the smallest incline of his head. "You kept him alive in a storm. Consider the account less uneven than it was." Later, as the last delegations prepared to leave, Bastian found her near the Great Hall doors. "The rogues who attacked my patrol earlier this winter were identified 2 days ago," he told her. "A faction operating independently, with no connection to a council pack or noble house. They had been testing border weaknesses for months, waiting for winter to thin the patrols. My men located their camp and dismantled it before they could strike again. So that's finished. That's finished." He said it simply, without ceremony, the kind of closure that didn't need embellishment to matter. Gwyneth returned to Vantry territory 2 weeks later, not as the exiled daughter sent to a border cabin to keep her shame out of sight, but as the king's mate and Vantry's acting alpha, riding at the head of a small procession that drew every villager from their homes to watch her pass. Coraline had been transferred to council custody to begin the sentence already handed down, and Alaric had not been seen since his banishment, gone north or south or nowhere at all, his fate no longer Wyneth's concern to track. She walked through the Vantry house that had once belonged to her father, now standing empty of the authority that had governed it for decades, and found the rooms smaller than she remembered them, less imposing without the weight of his judgment pressing through every hallway. The pack that remained looked to her now, uncertain, but willing, waiting to understand what kind of alpha she intended to be, and what kind of king's mate she would choose to become. She did not have every answer yet, but she had time, and a bond that no longer ached with distance, and a bloodline she'd spent 4 years believing was a failure instead of simply late in arriving. Outside, snow had begun falling again, soft and unhurried, settling over the territory that had once cast her out and now waited, quietly, to see what she would build in its place.